The year is 1519. The air in Augsburg is thick and heavy, saturated with the scent of wax, expensive incense, and an unspoken tension you can feel on your skin. In lavish halls, hidden from the eyes of commoners, the fate of the Holy Roman Empire, and therefore all of Europe, is being decided. The continent's two greatest monarchs, Francis I of France and Charles Habsburg of Spain, are locked in a mortal struggle for the imperial crown. Their weapons are not swords and armies, but gold, bottomless sacks of gold, which they shower upon the 7 prince-electors whose votes will determine the future ruler. It seems as if only kings are playing on this chessboard, but this is merely an illusion. In the shadows, in his Augsburg office, lined with embossed leather and filled with oak cabinets of debt ledgers, sits a man with no title and no crown. His name is Jakob Fugger. He wears no armor. His hands have never known the weight of a sword. But it is his will, as cold and unyielding as steel, that is now deciding the outcome of this battle of titans. When Charles's envoys report in despair that Francis's treasury is inexhaustible and he is willing to pay any price, Fugger merely curls his lip in contempt. He has already made his choice. He has bet on the Habsburgs, and he will not allow some French upstart to ruin his plans. In this decisive moment, he does the unthinkable. He issues bills of exchange for a colossal sum, over 850,000 florins, the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars today. This is more than the annual income of most kingdoms. It is a financial blow of such force that it sweeps Francis off the board. The electors, blinded by the glitter of Fugger's gold, unanimously elect Charles, who will henceforth be known as Emperor Charles V. And here it is, the central dramatic paradox in all its glory. A simple banker, the grandson of a village weaver, has just bought the most powerful empire in the world for his debtor, while remaining in the shadows, invisible to history. How? Why did the world allow the fates of kings and popes to be decided by a man whose only power lay in the numbers on a piece of paper? This question is the key to understanding not only the Renaissance, but also the birth of the world we live in today. To understand how this descendant of a simple weaver was able to place a golden bridle on Europe's greatest dynasty, we must return to the source, to a world on the cusp of change, desperately in need of a new master. Europe at the end of the 15th century is a giant patchwork quilt, stitched together from hundreds of kingdoms, duchies, bishoprics, and free cities. The Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, the heart of this world, is a colossus with feet of clay, torn apart by the ambitions of local princes who only nominally submit to the emperor. In the West, centralized monarchies like France and England are growing stronger. In the East, the Ottomans, who captured Constantinople in 1453, threaten the very existence of the Christian world. The Church, once an unshakable monolith, is mired in corruption and simony, turning faith into a commodity. And in this boiling cauldron, the old rules no longer apply. For centuries, power was measured by land and the number of vassals. The aristocracy, whose blood was considered blue and whose lineage was traced back to ancient heroes, looked down with contempt on those engaged in trade, considering it an unworthy occupation for a nobleman. But a new era is dawning. The age of discovery, when the ships of Columbus and Vasco da Gama push back the boundaries of the known world, opening up access to unprecedented wealth. The age of gunpowder, when a knight in shining armor becomes a helpless target for a cannonball, and the outcome of war is decided not by valor and honor, but by the number of cannons and land-snecked mercenaries. And all of this, the ships, the cannons, the armies, requires money. money that the kings and princes, with their feudal economy based on land rents, catastrophically lack. They live in debt, mortgaging their crowns, their lands, the future of their dynasties. And in this world, where blood and steel increasingly yield to gold and calculation, a new type of ruler emerges. A man who understands that true power lies not in castles and armies, but in the control of financial flows. This world, standing at a crossroads, thirsting for gold like parched earth for rain, was the perfect stage for the rise of the House of Fugger. The story of the Fugger family is the very essence of the American dream, realized in medieval Germany 300 years before the Founding Fathers. It begins not in royal palaces, but in the modest village of Graben, near Augsburg. The founder of the dynasty, Hans Fugger, was a simple weaver who came to the prosperous imperial city in 1367. He owned no land and had no coat of arms. His only capital was his skilled hands and a sharp commercial instinct. While the aristocrats despised craftsmanship, the Fuggers saw it as a path to prosperity. They didn't just weave, they traded, buying cotton in Venice and selling finished cloth throughout Germany. Each generation added another brick to the edifice of family wealth, acting with a methodical, almost religious devotion to their business. Their motto could have been work, thrift, calculation. They didn't spend money on lavish balls and jousting tournaments. Instead, they invested every spare guilder back into the business, expanding their network, buying up assets, and diversifying risks. This was a legacy not of blood, but of mentality. They thought like capitalists in a completely feudal world. Hans's sons, Andreas and Jakob the Elder, turned the modest weaving workshop into a major trading house. But it was the grandsons, especially the three sons of Jakob the Elder, Ulrich, Georg, and the youngest, Jakob, later nicknamed the Rich, who took the family to a completely different level. They understood a fundamental truth of the new era. Trading textiles is good, but real power lies in finance and the extraction of raw materials. They were outsiders, commoners, but this gave them an advantage. They were not bound by the aristocratic code of honor that forbade usury. They were not burdened by feudal obligations. Their only religion was the balance sheet, and their only God was profit. And this cold, rational grip, inherited from their artisan ancestors, allowed them to see opportunities where others saw only chaos. They were willing to lend to anyone, emperor or pope, knowing that debt is the strongest chain of all. The turning point that transformed the Fuggers from merely wealthy merchants into financial titans was an event seemingly far removed from the world of high politics: the discovery of rich silver and copper deposits in Tyrol. For Europe in the second half of the 15th century, this was akin to striking oil in the 20th. Silver was not just a precious metal, it was the lifeblood of the economy. It was used to mint coins, pay mercenaries, and served as the universal measure of wealth and power. The ruler of Tyrol, Archduke Sigismund of Habsburg, was an eccentric and extravagant man, constantly in need of money for his ambitious projects and luxurious court. He owned mountains full of treasure, but had neither the technology nor the capital to exploit them efficiently. And this is where the Fuggers, led at the time by the eldest brother, Ulrich, stepped onto the stage. They offered Sigismund a deal he couldn't refuse. They would provide him with huge loans, and in return, they would receive not just the right to develop the mines, but control overall production. It was a stroke of genius. The Fuggers weren't just lending money at interest, as other moneylenders did. They were getting their hands on a strategic resource. This was a sign of a new era, where ownership of the means of production became more important than an aristocratic title. They brought the most advanced mining and smelting technologies of the time from Saxony to Tyrol, dramatically increasing productivity. The mines of Schwaz and other Tyrolean sites turned into a gigantic money-making machine, and this entire machine worked for the Fuggers. They controlled the flow of silver that flooded Europe, and this gave them unprecedented leverage. They could manipulate prices, create shortages or surpluses of cash, and influence the economies of entire nations. For the Habsburgs, this was the beginning of a fatal addiction. Each new loan dragged them deeper into a pit of debt. They mortgaged the rights to customs duties, taxes, and lands to the Fuggers. Their political power became increasingly a fiction, propped up only by the money of commoners from Augsburg. In this world, metal had truly become more valuable than blood. And Jakob Fugger, the youngest of the brothers, watching this process, learned the most important lesson. He who controls the sources of wealth also controls those who wear the crowns. But to manage such a complex and risky game required not only capital and resources, but also unique knowledge that no monarch in Europe possessed. And the forge where Jakob Fugger's financial genius was hammered into shape was Venice. In his youth, while his older brothers were already managing the family business in Augsburg, Jakob, who was initially destined for a career in the church, was sent to study at the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, the German warehouse in Venice. This was not just a city on water. It was the financial center of the world, a melting pot of cultures and commercial innovations. It was here, in the labyrinth of canals and trading offices, that Jakob absorbed the spirit of modern capitalism. He studied not theology and Latin, but a much more powerful magic, the art of double-entry bookkeeping. This system, invented by Italian merchants, was a true revolution. It allowed for the precise tracking of debits and credits, assets and liabilities, providing a clear picture of a business's financial health. For most European rulers, whose treasuries were managed chaotically and primitively, this was like higher mathematics. Jakob, however, mastered this tool to perfection. He understood that the ledger was a map of power. It showed where weaknesses were hidden and where opportunities lay. In Venice, he saw how the first banks operated, how bills of exchange and letters of credit were used, and how risks were insured. He observed how the Venetian doges, mere elected rulers of a merchant republic, dictated their will to kings and sultans through the power of their fleet and capital. He realized the power of information. The Venetians knew about events in Constantinople or Alexandria before the emperor in Vienna, and they used this knowledge to turn a profit. This experience shaped his worldview. He returned to Augsburg not just as a merchant, but as a financial strategist who thought in global terms. He understood that the world was a giant ledger, and the one who kept the books was its true master. His mind, honed in the Venetian forge, saw not kings and armies, but assets and liabilities, risks and potential profits. And it was this cold, analytical approach, devoid of all sentiment and feudal prejudice, that allowed him to begin his great game. Returning from Venice, armed with cutting-edge knowledge and unbending ambition, Jakob Fugger began to act. His first independent gambit, which became the hallmark of his style, was played out in that same Tyrolean chessboard, prepared by his brothers. Archduke Sigismund, despite the huge income from the mines, continued to spend more than he earned, and once again found himself on the brink of bankruptcy. Other creditors, seeing his dire situation, refused to grant new loans. But Jakob saw not risk in this crisis, but opportunity. He did what would later become the golden rule of predatory capitalism. He offered Sigismund the largest loan of his life, 150,000 florins, but on draconian terms. In return, he demanded not just collateral, but the complete transfer of rights to the Tyrolean mines, from simple management to effective ownership. Legally, it was framed as a temporary concession, but Fugger knew perfectly well that the Habsburg would never be able to repay this debt. It was a masterstroke. He didn't overthrow the ruler by force or organize a conspiracy. He simply used the ruler's own weakness, greed, and financial incompetence. He placed the first golden chain around the neck of the powerful Habsburg dynasty, a chain that would grow shorter and tighter with each passing year. This episode reveals the essence of his method. First, he was always ready to take a colossal but calculated risk. Second, his goal was not just interest on a loan, but control over strategic assets, resources that generate a constant cash flow. Third, he masterfully used legal loopholes, framing the seizure of assets as a legitimate commercial transaction. He turned a feudal ruler into his junior partner, and then into a hired manager on his own land. This was the beginning of a process that historians would call the privatization of the state. Fugger, a simple burgher, became the shadow ruler of Tyrol. He decided how much silver to mine, to whom to sell it, and at what price. And as he watched aristocrats, whose ancestors were knights and crusaders, humbly beg him for money, Jakob Fugger became firmly convinced that the old world was doomed, and in the new world, the one who controlled the capital would rule. What drove this man? Was it a simple lust for profit, a desire to become the richest man in the world? The pursuit of profit was certainly in the blood of every Fugger. But for Jakob, money itself was not the ultimate goal. It was an instrument, a means to achieve something much greater, almost metaphysical: immortality. He lived in an age when the idea of a personal legacy, of a fame that would outlast the centuries, was in the air. Artists, poets, monarchs, all were obsessed with leaving their mark on history. But Jakob chose a completely new, unprecedented path. He could not, like Michelangelo, sculpt David, or, like Columbus, discover a new continent. His genius was of a different kind: cold, calculating, systematic. He decided to build something more enduring than cathedrals and empires, a financial dynasty whose power would be based not on the fragile right of blood or the fortunes of war, but on the eternal laws of capital. This was his secret, all-consuming ambition. He saw how easily kingdoms fell, how monarchs were overthrown, how entire aristocratic families disappeared in the crucible of wars and intrigues. Their power was personalized, tied to the figure of the ruler. Jakob, however, sought to create an impersonal, self-perpetuating system of power that would exist and grow even after his death. He wanted the name Fugger to become synonymous not just with wealth, but with a force capable of weathering any political storm. This thirst for immortality through capital explains many of his actions. It explains his willingness to take enormous risks, his ruthlessness with debtors, his contempt for an aristocracy he considered degenerate and inefficient. In his eyes, kings and popes were merely temporary figures, instruments in his grand strategy. He financed their wars, their coronations, their cathedral constructions not out of loyalty or piety, but because it allowed him to integrate his empire deeper into the fabric of European power, making it indispensable. He was creating a system where all roads led not to Rome, but to his office in Augsburg. And in this system, he was not just a banker, but a demiurge, sculpting a new world in his own image. To realize such a grand design required a new type of organization, unlike a feudal estate or a merchant guild. And Jakob Fugger created it, the world's first multinational corporation, an invisible empire whose tentacles enveloped all of Europe. The foundation of this empire was information. Long before the advent of newspapers and the telegraph, Fugger organized his own news service, one of the first in history. His agents, scattered across all key cities from Lisbon and Antwerp to Venice and Krakow, were more than just trade representatives. They were his eyes and ears. They gathered intelligence on everything: the price of pepper in India, the health of the Ottoman Sultan, political intrigues at the French court, a brewing peasant revolt in Germany. These reports, often written in code, were delivered to Augsburg by a system of horse-mounted couriers that operated with unprecedented speed for the time. As a result, Jakob Fugger knew more about what was happening in the world than any king or even the Pope himself. He could predict crop failures and start buying grain. He knew about an impending war and would provide loans to both sides in advance. He received insider information about an upcoming currency devaluation and managed to move his assets in time. Information was his primary weapon, allowing him to always be one step ahead of competitors and debtors. The second pillar of his empire was a vast network of debt obligations. He deliberately turned the most powerful people in the world into his clients. He understood the psychology of power. Debt not only earns interest, it creates dependency and humiliation. An emperor who borrows money from you for his coronation can no longer speak to you as a subject. He becomes a supplicant. Fugger kept his ledgers with manic precision, and each entry was a link in the chain that bound the mighty. His army consisted not of soldiers, but of lawyers, accountants, and managers, who ensured contracts were enforced and ruthlessly collected collateral in case of default. This system was flexible, decentralized, and virtually invulnerable to traditional warfare. It could not be conquered. Its fortresses could not be stormed, because its fortresses were scattered across hundreds of debt ledgers in dozens of European cities. The perfect embodiment of this system of dependency was the Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian I of Habsburg, nicknamed the Last Knight. This monarch was a living anachronism, a man whose dreams and ambitions belonged to a glorious chivalric past, but whose political realities demanded money he never had. Maximilian was obsessed with crusades, dynastic marriages intended to unite all of Europe under his rule, and lavish tournaments. He was a master of self-promotion, creating an image of the ideal Christian sovereign. But behind this glittering facade lay a financial abyss. His reign was a series of endless wars and diplomatic intrigues, each requiring enormous expenditure. And the main, soon to be the only source of funds for him, was Jakob Fugger. Their relationship is a classic example of symbiosis between a predator and a victim, unaware of its plight. Fugger financed everything, from Maximilian's wars in Italy against France to the weddings of his children, which, by the way, formed the basis of Charles V's future giant empire. In return, Fugger received ever more concessions: a monopoly on the silver trade, control over customs, and a mortgage on state revenues for years to come. Maximilian was essentially selling off his state piece by piece to play the part of a great monarch. He became Fugger's first crowned puppet. The Augsburg banker dictated terms to him, could delay payments at the most critical moments, forcing the emperor to make political concessions. There is evidence that when Maximilian visited Augsburg, he stayed not in the castle, but in Fugger's house, an unheard-of breach of the class hierarchy. The emperor, considered God's regent on earth, became the guest and debtor of a common burgher. For Fugger, this was not just a profitable business. It was an assertion of his power, a demonstration that the New World belonged to men like him. He did not seek to overthrow Maximilian. On the contrary, a weak but legitimate emperor, completely dependent on his will, was advantageous to him. He maintained the illusion of power for Maximilian, while he himself, remaining in the shadows, redrew the economic map of Europe. If emperors were important clients, then the grand prize, the true Klondike for Jakob Fugger, was the papal throne in Rome. By the early 16th century, the Catholic Church was not just a spiritual institution, but a gigantic transnational corporation with vast landholdings, its own tax system, the tithe, and an inexhaustible source of income, the sale of faith. The Renaissance popes, such as Alexander VI Borgia, Julius II, or Leo X de' Medici, behaved more like secular monarchs than spiritual shepherds. They waged wars, built luxurious palaces, maintained brilliant courts, and patronized the greatest artists. All of this required colossal sums of money. And here, Fugger found a gold mine. He became the Vatican's chief banker. His Roman branch managed the transfer of church collections from all over Europe to the papal treasury. But the pinnacle of this cynical business was the sale of indulgences. The idea that one could buy forgiveness for sins with money had existed before, but under Pope Leo X, it reached an unprecedented scale. Leo, needing funds to complete the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, announced a massive sale of indulgences throughout Germany. But the logistics of this enterprise were complex, and that's when Fugger stepped in. He struck a cynical deal with the papal curia and Archbishop Albrecht of Brandenburg, who was himself up to his ears in debt to Fugger. Fugger paid a huge sum to Rome and the archbishop in advance, and in return, he received the right to organize the sales and keep half of the proceeds to repay the debts and interest. In effect, he outsourced absolution, turning it into a commercial franchise. His agents, along with papal preachers like the famous Johann Tetzel, traveled across the German lands, selling salvation like any other commodity. This was the apex of his power and his cynicism. He monetized the most sacred aspect of human life, faith and the fear of judgment after death. He turned an institution that for centuries had claimed moral authority into his commercial department. And at that moment, he may have, for the first time, crossed a line, underestimating the consequences. He thought he was just conducting another profitable business, but in reality, he was lighting the fuse to a powder keg that was about to blow up all of Europe. October 31st, 1517. A humble monk and theology professor named Martin Luther nails his famous 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. This document, written in Latin and intended for academic debate, was directed against the abuses in the sale of indulgences. Luther did not yet contemplate a break with Rome. He sincerely believed that the Pope was unaware of the outrages being committed by his emissaries in Germany. But his theses, translated into German and printed thanks to Gutenberg's new invention, spread across the country like wildfire. They fell on fertile ground. German princes were unhappy about the huge sums of money flowing to Rome. The common people, crushed by levies, felt cheated. And although Jakob Fugger's name was not mentioned directly in the Theses, he was the invisible architect and main beneficiary of the very system Luther was attacking. The shadow of the Augsburg banker stood behind every indulgence sold, behind every florin siphoned from German pockets. Luther, without realizing it, had struck a blow not so much at theology as at the business model of Fugger and the Pope. This was a classic example of unintended consequences. Fugger, in his quest for total control and profit, had created a system of exploitation so cynical and efficient that it provoked a reaction of colossal force. He saw the world through the lens of debit and credit, and completely failed to account for a factor that could not be measured in money: human faith, the thirst for justice, and a sense of national humiliation. The Reformation, which began with these theses, became a most serious threat to Fugger. It not only undermined his most profitable business, connected with the papal curia, but also threatened to plunge Germany, his home base, into the chaos of religious wars. The confiscation of church lands, the refusal to pay Rome, the ideological schism, all of this hit his interests. Paradoxically, the era's greatest puppet master, accustomed to calculating everything, had, through his own actions, provoked the emergence of a force he could no longer control. Martin Luther became his ideological antithesis, a man who challenged not a king or a pope, but the very power of gold over the human soul. While the fire of the Reformation raged in Germany, Jakob Fugger continued to weave his web, and his next strategic move was to monopolize the European copper market. If silver was the blood of the economy, copper was the muscle of war. The 16th century saw an artillery revolution. Cast bronze cannons became the decisive factor on the battlefield. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. Therefore, whoever controlled copper controlled the production of the most modern and deadly weapons. The largest copper deposits in Europe at that time were in Hungary, and Fugger, using his standard tactics, began to systematically take over the Hungarian mining industry. He provided the Hungarian crown, constantly in need of money for wars against the Turks, with huge loans secured by the income from copper mines. Step by step, contract by contract, he squeezed out local competitors, and by the early 1520s had become a de facto monopolist. He created a gigantic, vertically integrated holding company. His companies mined the ore in Hungary, processed it in their own plants, transported it along trade routes he controlled to Baltic and North Sea ports like Danzig and Antwerp, and from there sold it all over Europe. He could dictate prices. Kings who wanted modern artillery had to bow to Fugger. He sold copper to the Habsburgs for their wars with France, and to the Portuguese to equip their ships sailing to India. This was the pinnacle of his resource control strategy. He understood that financial power without control over real physical assets was vulnerable. Therefore, he built his empire on 3 pillars: silver, money, copper, war, and information, knowledge. His copper throne gave him another powerful lever of pressure on monarchs. He could speed up or slow down supplies, influencing the course of military campaigns. He became an indispensable partner to any ruler planning a war. And this once again demonstrated the paradox of his position. A man commanding not a single soldier essentially controlled the military-industrial complex of an entire continent, all while remaining in the shadow of his Augsburg office. Jakob Fugger's ambitions were not limited to Europe. His gaze, like that of the most visionary rulers of his time, was fixed beyond the horizon, towards the new lands discovered by Portuguese and Spanish navigators. He was interested not so much in geographical discoveries as in new trade routes and sources of exotic goods that promised fabulous profits. The grand prize in this global game was the spice trade: pepper, cloves, nutmeg, which were worth their weight in gold in Europe. Traditionally, this market was controlled by the Venetians, who bought spices from Arab merchants in the ports of the Levant. But after Vasco da Gama discovered the sea route to India around Africa in 1498, the Portuguese had the opportunity to break this monopoly. However, organizing expensive naval expeditions required enormous funds for the Portuguese crown. And once again, Fugger appeared on the scene. He became one of the main investors in Portuguese colonial enterprises. He financed the construction and equipping of ships going to India, and in return received a share of the profits and exclusive rights to distribute spices in northern Europe through his trading post in Antwerp. His reach extended to Calicut and Goa. He participated in the creation of the first truly global trading network. Pepper, bought in India with Fugger's money, was transported on Portuguese ships to Lisbon. From there, Fugger's agents delivered it to Antwerp, which consequently became the main economic center of Europe. And from there, the goods were distributed throughout Germany and further east. Fugger diversified his empire, making it less dependent on European political turmoil. He played on all boards simultaneously, financing the emperor in Europe and colonial acquisitions in Asia. This demonstrates the scale of his thinking. He was not just a German banker, he was a global player, one of the first in history. He understood that the future lay in world trade, and he sought to occupy a central place in it. And in this, he was again ahead of his time, creating a business model that would become dominant only centuries later. And so we return to the moment where we began, the election of the Holy Roman Emperor in 1519. This event became the culmination of all of Jakob Fugger's previous activities, his greatest gamble, and the most vivid demonstration of his shadow power. After the death of Maximilian I, two candidates vied for the throne: his grandson, the young King Charles of Spain, a Habsburg, and the brilliant King Francis I of France. For Fugger, this was a moment of truth. The election of Francis would have been a disaster for him. The French king was his debtor, but also the bitter enemy of the Habsburgs, Fugger's main clients and partners. Moreover, Francis might have tried to create his own financial system, independent of the Augsburg banker. On the other hand, Charles Habsburg was already up to his ears in debt to Fugger. His election as emperor would not only make him the most powerful monarch in Europe, uniting Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, southern Italy, and the Spanish colonies in America under his rule, but would also make him even more dependent on his creditor. Fugger bet everything on Charles. An unprecedented war of purses began. Francis, supported by other banking houses, offered huge bribes to the electors. But Fugger, using the full might of his financial empire, outbid him. He mobilized a gigantic sum for the time, 850,000 florins. Part of this money was his own, part he borrowed from other investors, acting as a guarantor. It was a highly complex financial operation, a demonstration of his ability to accumulate capital on an unseen scale. He didn't just provide money, he organized the entire logistics of the bribery. His agents negotiated with the electors, transferred bills of exchange, and guaranteed the payments. And he won. Charles was elected. At that moment, the paradox of Fugger's power reached its zenith. He, a burgher without a drop of noble blood, had effectively appointed the ruler for hundreds of millions of people. He created an empire on which the sun never set, but he did it not for himself, but for his debtor, securing for himself the ultimate prize, total control over the finances of that empire. It was the final victory of capital over blood, of calculation over tradition. After this, no one in Europe could doubt who was truly the most powerful force on the continent. The chessboard of Europe after 1519 was a most complex web of alliances and conflicts, and at the center of this web, pulling the strings, sat Jakob Fugger. His gallery of allies and enemies was as varied as it was powerful. His main ally and, at the same time, his main asset was, of course, Emperor Charles V. Their relationship was a complex blend of partnership and hidden antagonism. Charles needed Fugger to finance his countless wars against France, the Turks, and the Protestant princes. Fugger needed Charles as a guarantor of his investments and privileges. But beneath the surface of this alliance lay deep tension. Charles, raised with a consciousness of his divine right to rule, must have felt humiliated by his dependence on a common banker. Fugger, for his part, saw the emperor not as a sovereign, but as a risky, albeit highly profitable asset. His sworn enemy on the geopolitical stage was Francis I, King of France. His rivalry with Charles V became the leitmotif of the first half of the 16th century, and Fugger was an active participant in this struggle, consistently funding anti-French coalitions. The popes of Rome, especially Leo X, were less allies and more high-ranking clients for Fugger, whose spiritual and financial needs he skillfully exploited. But his most unusual and dangerous enemy was one who had neither armies nor a treasury: Martin Luther. The reformer was Fugger's ideological foe. He personified the spiritual principle rebelling against the world of mammon that the banker was building. In his sermons and pamphlets, Luther fiercely denounced usury and luxury, and although he rarely mentioned Fugger by name, everyone knew who he was talking about. Fugger, in turn, supported the Catholic Party and the Emperor in their fight against Protestantism, less out of religious conviction and more for business reasons. The Reformation threatened stability and therefore his business. Thus, Fugger found himself at the very center of all the key conflicts of his era: political, economic, and religious. He navigated between these gigantic forces, using their contradictions for his own gain, and in this complex game, he proved himself to be not just a banker, but the greatest political strategist of his time. In 1524, Germany was engulfed by the flames of the Peasants' War, the largest popular uprising in Europe before the French Revolution. Hundreds of thousands of peasants, inspired by radical preachers of the Reformation and driven to desperation by exorbitant taxes and feudal oppression, took up arms. They demanded the abolition of serfdom, fair courts, and the return of communal lands. It was a moment of truth, a critical choice for many, and for Jakob Fugger as well. At first glance, as someone from a common background, he might have sympathized with the rebels. Moreover, some of the peasants' demands, directed against the old feudal aristocracy, were objectively in his favor. But Fugger thought in different categories. His decision was cold, pragmatic, and ruthless. He immediately and unconditionally sided with the princes and aristocrats, his main debtors and the guarantors of stability. He saw this uprising not as a struggle for justice, but as chaos that threatened the very foundation of his empire. Revolution always poses a risk to property. It means the cancellation of debts, the disruption of trade routes. Fugger could not allow this. He allocated huge funds to the Swabian League, a military-political alliance of South German princes, feudal lords, and imperial cities, which became the main force in suppressing the revolt. Fugger's money went to hire landsknechts, who dealt with the poorly armed and disorganized peasant bands with incredible brutality. According to various estimates, up to 100,000 people died during the suppression of the uprising. This choice definitively shaped Fugger's historical image. It showed that, despite his origins, he was an enemy of any social change coming from below. His interests were inextricably linked to the existing power structure, which he himself had transformed from within. He preferred dealing with indebted kings to an unpredictable popular force. He chose order and profit over justice and compassion. And in this sense, he became one of the first representatives of a new class, the great bourgeoisie, which, at a critical moment, will always choose an alliance with the aristocracy against the threat of revolution. The blood of tens of thousands of peasants became another, darkest stone in the foundation of his financial empire. By the mid-1520s, Jakob Fugger had reached the zenith of his power. He was the richest man in the world, his fortune exceeding the assets of all his competitors combined. He financed the emperor, controlled the papal curia, and owned mines from Hungary to Spain. And at this moment, he committed an act that could be seen as a manifestation of supreme pride, or as the ancient Greeks called it, hubris. In 1523, he sent Emperor Charles V, the most powerful monarch on the planet, a letter that went down in history. This letter contained none of the subservient formulas customary when addressing a sovereign. It was written in the dry, businesslike language of a creditor, reminding a negligent debtor of his obligations. Fugger wrote, "It is well known and as clear as day that your imperial majesty could not have obtained the Roman crown without my help." And then, unabashedly, he reminded him that, if he had not supported the House of Austria, the crown would have gone to the French, which would have been the greatest detriment to the Habsburgs. This was unheard of. A common burgher, holding no aristocratic titles, openly declared to the emperor that he owed him his throne. He was not asking, but demanding the prompt repayment of debts, pointing out that his money had allowed Charles to ascend to the throne. This letter is the quintessence of Fugger's self-awareness. He no longer considered himself a subject. He saw himself as an equal, if not superior, to those who wore crowns. He felt himself to be a kingmaker, a demiurge who had set great historical forces in motion. In this act, there was not only business acumen, but also a deep, almost philosophical contempt for the old aristocracy. He was, in effect, saying, "Your power, based on ancient lineage and divine right, is a fiction. Real power is money, and that power belongs to me." This moment of pride was dangerous. It demonstrated to everyone, including the emperor himself, the true scale of Fugger's influence, bringing him out of the comfortable shadows and into the bright light. And although Charles, in desperate need of money, swallowed this pill, he surely did not forget the humiliation. Fugger had, perhaps for the first time, allowed his pride to overcome his caution, and this became a harbinger of troubles to come, showing that even such a genius of calculation had his human weaknesses. Despite his apparent omnipotence, the first cracks were already beginning to appear in the foundation of Fugger's empire, and the main factor undermining his greatness was the very religious fire he had helped to kindle. The Reformation, gaining strength in Germany and spreading throughout Northern Europe, struck at his business model from several directions. First, Protestant princes, who adopted Luther's teachings, immediately confiscated church lands and property in their territories. Since Fugger was the church's largest creditor, these assets often served as collateral for his loans. Their expropriation meant direct financial losses. Second, the refusal of entire countries and regions to pay tithes and other fees to Rome undermined the financial well-being of the papal curia, making it a less reliable client. The indulgence business, once a gold mine, practically ceased in Protestant lands. Third, the religious schism plunged the Holy Roman Empire, his primary market, into a state of permanent civil war. The wars between Catholics and Protestants, which his main debtor, Emperor Charles V, was forced to wage, required ever more expenditure, driving the Habsburg treasury into an even deeper debt hole. Fugger found himself in a paradoxical situation. He was forced to finance wars that were destroying the very economic environment in which he thrived. He was chained to the sinking ship of the Catholic Party and the Habsburg dynasty. These religious storms were harbingers of a new world, one in which ideology and national identity would play an ever-increasing role, and where universal power based on money and religion would begin to weaken. Fugger, a man of the old era in this respect, never fully grasped the nature of these new, irrational forces. He tried to combat them with his usual methods, money and political intrigue, but the fire of the Reformation could no longer be extinguished with gold. It was burning away the old ties, the old obligations, and the old financial bridges upon which his entire invisible empire rested. Another problem that eventually grew into an existential threat was the very nature of Fugger's main asset, the empire of Charles the Elector. This gigantic monarchy, scattered across the globe, an empire on which, it was said, the sun never set, was not only a source of power, but also a bottomless financial pit. Charles waged wars on several fronts simultaneously, with France in Italy, with the Ottoman Turks in the Mediterranean and Hungary, and with the Protestant princes in Germany. Each of these wars required astronomical sums. Moreover, governing such diverse territories, from Peru to Vienna, was incredibly expensive. The constant flow of silver and gold from the American colonies, on which so much hope was placed, did not cover even a fraction of the expenses. As a result, Charles V and his administration lived constantly in debt, and the main creditor was Jakob Fugger. Fugger was trapped by his own success. He was too deeply involved to get out of the game. The collapse of the Habsburg Empire would have meant the collapse of his own house, as most of his assets were tied up in loans to the crown. He was forced to provide new loans to save his previous investments. This is a classic scenario known today as the too-big-to-fail problem. Fugger became a hostage to his main client. He could threaten, write angry letters, demand repayment. But in the end, he always provided new funds because the alternative was even worse. The endless wars of Charles V were draining capital from Europe, leading to tax increases that caused revolts and disrupted trade. Fugger, the creator of this empire, now watched with alarm as it turned into a giant machine for burning money. His money. He began to realize that even his seemingly inexhaustible resources had a limit, and that he had tied his fate to a political structure that carried the seeds of its own financial self-destruction. The debt pit he had so skillfully dug for others threatened to swallow him as well. Against the backdrop of these global problems, competition was also intensifying. Although the House of Fugger was the most powerful, it was not the only player in Europe's financial market. Jakob's main rivals were the Welzers, another influential banking family from Augsburg. The shadow war between these two dynasties was no less fierce than the battles of kings on the fields of war. The Welzers tried to replicate Fugger's success, also investing in the mining industry and financing monarchs. They even received the entire colony of Venezuela in South America from Charles V as a concession, an unprecedented deal. They competed with Fugger for contracts, for access to the emperor's ear, for the right to collect taxes. This struggle was fought with methods far from chivalrous. Court intrigues, industrial espionage, attempts to poach key employees, and the spreading of rumors to undermine a competitor's creditworthiness were all part of the game. Jakob Fugger had to be constantly on guard, protecting his empire not only from kings and revolutionaries, but also from financial predators, just like himself. Furthermore, new centers of financial power were emerging across Europe, in Antwerp, Genoa, and Lyon. Italian bankers with centuries of experience were not going to give up their positions easily. This competitive environment required Fugger to constantly mobilize all his resources, constantly search for new sources of income and new business methods. He could not afford to relax for a moment. Any mistake, any miscalculation could be exploited by his rivals. This shadow war was another factor draining his strength and resources, showing that even at the pinnacle of the financial Olympus, there is no peace. In the world he himself had created, a world of ruthless capitalist competition, only the strongest, the most cunning, and the most merciless survived. To these external threats was added a deep internal crisis that sapped the dynasty's strength from within, the problem of succession. Jakob Fugger, who had built a grand empire with the expectation that it would last forever, faced a fundamental human problem. He had no one to pass it on to. He was married, but his marriage was childless. His older brothers, Ulrich and Georg, who had started the business with him, were already dead. They had children, but Jakob, with his authoritarian character and absolute confidence in his own genius, did not trust his nephews. He considered them not capable enough, not tough enough, and not dedicated enough to manage such a complex and risky machine. He continued to control all key decisions personally, keeping all the strings of management in his own hands. It was the classic trap of a great company's founder. He had created a system that was too complex and too personalized, completely dependent on his personal genius. His head held all the insider information, all the complex schemes, all the informal agreements. His fear that his heirs would destroy his life's work paralyzed the process of power transfer. This internal drama added a tragic dimension to his character. The man who easily manipulated kings and popes was powerless against simple biological reality. He could buy an empire, but he could not buy a worthy heir. This succession crisis created uncertainties and made his empire vulnerable. Competitors and debtors eagerly awaited the moment when the old lion would weaken or die, hoping that the system would collapse after him. In his last years, Jakob was forced to frantically search for a solution, training and testing his nephews, primarily Anton Fugger, trying to instill in him all his experience and his iron will. The question of whether the dynasty could survive its creator remained open. A symbolic expression of the chaos that seemed to be spinning out of control, even for a master like Fugger, was the sack of Rome in May of 1527. This event, known as the Sacco di Roma, shocked the entire Christian world. The massive army of Emperor Charles V, composed mainly of German Lutheran Landsknechts and Spanish mercenaries, went on a rampage after not being paid and marched on Rome. They took the Eternal City by storm and subjected it to unprecedented devastation, which in its brutality surpassed even the barbarian invasions of antiquity. Soldiers looted churches and palaces, killed priests, and raped nuns. Pope Clement VII himself barely managed to take refuge in the Castel Sant'Angelo. For Fugger, this event was a multidimensional catastrophe. First, the army that sacked Rome was the army of his main client and debtor, Emperor Charles V, and it had mutinied because the imperial treasury was empty, meaning he could not pay the soldiers on time. This was a clear testament to the financial bankruptcy of the Habsburg system, in which Fugger had invested enormous sums. Second, the sack of Rome, the center of the Catholic world, dealt a terrible blow to the prestige and financial standing of the papal curia, another of his important clients. The Fugger Bank's Roman branch suffered huge losses. But most importantly, this event showed the limits of the puppet master's power. Fugger could finance armies, but he could not control them when they turned into a hungry, brutalized mob. He could make deals with kings and popes, but he could not manage the irrational forces of fanaticism, hatred, and chaos that his own activities had helped to unleash. The world he had so carefully built on rational calculation and legal contracts was plunging into an abyss of violence that no longer obeyed the logic of money. The sack of Rome became an ominous symbol of a new era, the era of religious wars, in which the golden threads he used to control the world began to snap. By the end of the 1520s, the clouds over the house of Fugger had gathered to their darkest. At the Diet of Augsburg in 1530, where Emperor Charles V tried to find a compromise between Catholics and Protestants, Jakob Fugger faced the most serious threat of his entire career. On one hand, the Protestant princes, feeling their strength, began to openly attack Fugger, accusing him of usury, monopolism, and of being the main financial pillar of their enemies, the Pope and the Emperor. They demanded the confiscation of his property and the annulment of his monopoly rights. On the other hand, the Emperor himself, his main debtor, was in a desperate financial situation. The amount of his debt to Fugger had reached astronomical figures, and many at court whispered that the easiest way to solve this problem was to declare state bankruptcy and simply forgive the debts. Fugger found himself between a rock and a hard place. His empire, built on lending to the powerful, was on the brink of an abyss because its debtors had become either too strong ideologically, the Protestants, to reckon with him, or too weak financially, the emperor, to pay him back. At that moment, one wrong move, one wrong decision by Charles V could have led to the collapse of his life's work. The bankruptcy of the House of Fugger would not have been just a private problem. It would have caused a domino effect, bringing down the entire financial system of Europe, as dozens of other banking houses, hundreds of trading companies, and the treasuries of several states depended on Fugger's credit. This was the first historical example of systemic risk, where the collapse of one institution threatens the entire system. Jakob had to use all his influence, all his diplomatic talent, all his connections to prevent a catastrophe. He conducted complex negotiations behind the scenes of the Diet, sometimes threatening, sometimes promising new loans, sometimes making concessions. He managed to keep the situation under control, but this crisis showed how fragile his position had become. He, the once all-powerful puppet master, was now forced to fight desperately for survival, balancing on the edge of a financial precipice. In the final years of his life, amidst growing threats and the awareness of his own mortality, Jakob Fugger took a step that seems completely out of character for a ruthless capitalist. He founded the Fuggerei. It was the world's first social housing project, and it still exists today. In his native Augsburg, a whole quarter of several dozen houses was built with his money, intended for poor, respectable Catholics. The residents received an apartment almost for free. Their only obligation was to pay a symbolic rent, 1 Rhenish guilder a year, and to pray daily for the salvation of Jakob Fugger's soul and that of his descendants. What was this? A sincere act of piety and repentance at the end of his life? A man who had amassed a fortune through ruthless exploitation, the sale of indulgences, and the financing of wars, suddenly decided to care for the poor? Or was it another cold and far-sighted calculation? Most likely, it was both. On one hand, Fugger was a man of his time, and despite all his cynicism, he could not have been entirely free from the fear of God's judgment. Perhaps the Fuggerei was his personal indulgence, an attempt to buy his way into heaven. But on the other hand, it was a brilliant PR move and a long-term investment in the dynasty's reputation. At a time when he was being accused from all sides of greed and usury, he was creating an image of himself as a generous patron and benefactor. The Fuggerei became a living monument to his generosity, meant to cement a positive image of the House of Fugger in the popular memory for centuries. It was the final touch to the portrait of a genius who could turn even charity into a tool for achieving his goals, eternal glory and the salvation of his soul. This project perfectly reflects the complexity and paradoxical nature of his character. He was simultaneously a predator and a creator, a cynic and a man thinking of eternity. The Fuggerei is his attempt to reconcile God and Mammon, leaving behind not only debt ledgers, but also something for which people would be grateful for centuries. Realizing that his time was running out, and that the world he knew was changing beyond recognition, Jakob Fugger made one last important decision. He officially handed over the management of his gigantic empire to his nephew, Anton Fugger. This process wasn't instantaneous. He had been grooming Anton for many years, gradually introducing him to the business, entrusting him with increasingly complex tasks. But in the end, he let go of the reins. This act of passing the scepter was not just a formal change of leadership. It was a tacit admission that the world he had created was becoming too complex and unmanageable even for him. The forces he had unleashed, the Reformation, global capitalism, the power of centralized states, had begun to live a life of their own. He saw that the old methods were no longer working as effectively. The conflict between Catholics and Protestants was fracturing markets. Kings, having learned financial tricks from him, were becoming more sophisticated and less reliable debtors. Competition was intensifying. Jakob's retreat into the shadows was the wise move of a strategist who knows when to leave the battlefield to save his army. He left his heir a prosperous but extremely vulnerable empire facing new challenges. He had done everything he could to ensure continuity, but he must have understood that the future of his dynasty would depend not only on financial genius, but also on luck and the ability to adapt to a rapidly changing world. His departure symbolized the end of an era of solitary titans capable of shaping world politics single-handedly. The time of larger, more impersonal forces, states, ideologies, world markets, was dawning. The puppet master, who had pulled the strings for nearly half a century, voluntarily left his post, perhaps with the bitter realization that the mechanism he had created had become so large and complex that it could no longer be managed in the old way. The finale of the story of Jakob Fugger and his dynasty is full of deep, situational irony. He, the kingmaker who built his power on financing and therefore strengthening centralized monarchical authority, ultimately gave rise to the very system that consumed his legacy. All his life, he worked to make the Habsburgs the most powerful dynasty in Europe, believing that a strong monarch dependent on him was the best guarantor of his investments. But he failed to account for one thing. The monsters he created, the absolutist states with their growing armies and bureaucracies, eventually developed a will of their own. Under Charles III's successors, especially his son, King Philip II of Spain, this system began to fail. Philip, who inherited his father's enormous debts, declared state bankruptcy several times during his reign. These bankruptcies were essentially a veiled refusal to pay his bills. And the main victim was the House of Fugger, which was the Spanish crown's largest creditor. Each such bankruptcy dealt a devastating blow to their fortune. The dynasty that Jakob had built to last forever began a slow decline, ruined by the very state it had helped to create. And herein lies the ultimate irony. Fugger taught kings to think in terms of state interest, which stands above any private obligations, and they learned this lesson all too well. It turned out that there is nothing riskier than lending to an absolute monarch who sets the laws himself and can renounce his debts at any moment. Jakob Fugger was a transitional figure. He thrived in an era of weakness for the old feudal institutions and the birth of new state ones. But as soon as these new states grew strong, they no longer needed such powerful private creditors and preferred either to create their own financial institutions or simply to destroy their former benefactors. Fugger was the catalyst for a process that ultimately made himself and his business model obsolete. On December 22, 1525, Jakob Fugger, nicknamed the Rich, died. His death was the complete opposite of his life. The man whose decisions sparked wars, toppled and enthroned monarchs, whose name was whispered in every palace in Europe, passed away quietly in his bed in his native Augsburg. He did not die on the battlefield, nor at the hand of an assassin, nor on the scaffold like many of those he dealt with. His end was peaceful and respectable, like that of a good burgher. And in this contrast lies a deep symbolism. While fires he had helped to ignite raged across Europe, the Peasants' War in Germany, fierce battles between Charles IV and Francis III in Italy, the puppet master calmly passed into eternity, leaving behind the largest fortune ever concentrated in the hands of a single individual. His death did not cause an immediate collapse, as many had feared. The system he created passed into the capable hands of his nephew Anton, continued to function. But his departure marked the end of an era. It was not just a banker who died. It was the last and most brilliant representative of that type of Renaissance man who seemed capable of bending the world to his will through the sheer force of his intellect. His peaceful death against the backdrop of the surrounding chaos is the final chord in the story of a man who learned to profit from instability, who built his order on the ruins of the old world, but who ultimately could not stop the processes he himself had set in motion. He left the stage at the very moment the play he had directed began to turn into a tragedy whose ending no one could predict. Jakob Fugger's legacy is as complex and ambiguous as he was himself. Through the centuries, his name has become synonymous with both unprecedented wealth and boundless cynicism. So who was he really? For some, especially socialist historians, he is the archetype of the predatory capitalist, a ruthless exploiter who profited from popular misery, financed wars, and suppressed uprisings. In their eyes, he is an evil genius who turned everything, including religion and human life, into a commodity. For others, he is a visionary, a financial genius, the architect of the modern world. They see in him the man who laid the foundations of the global economy, created the first transnational corporations, understood the power of information, and was the first to apply the principles of modern management. They point out that by financing the Habsburgs, he objectively helped to create a barrier against Ottoman expansion into Europe. Still others see him as a great patron of the arts, who donated huge sums for the construction of churches and for charity, the crown of which was the Fuggerei. He commissioned works from Titian and Dürer, and his residences in Augsburg were models of Renaissance architecture. He was neither a saint nor a demon. He was a product of his transitional era and, at the same time, its active creator. He operated according to the laws of nascent capitalism, laws which he himself was helping to formulate. And these laws were cruel. His main contribution to history was that he proved in practice that financial power can be stronger than political and military power. He was the first to build a global empire, not on land and swords, but on numbers in accounting ledgers. And in this sense, whether we like it or not, all of us, from heads of state concerned about national debt to ordinary people with a mortgage, are his heirs. He created the world we live in, a world where the flow of capital determines the fate of nations. So we have reached the end and are ready to give a final answer to the main question posed in the title. Why and how could an ordinary banker decide the fates of kings and popes while remaining in the shadows? The solution to this paradox is multi-layered. First, Fugger operated at a unique historical moment, a period of power vacuum. The old feudal system was dying, while new centralized states were just being born and were desperately weak financially. He filled this void by offering the resource everyone needed most: money. Second, his power lay not just in money, but in his control over its sources, silver and copper mines, and in the revolutionary financial technologies brought from Italy. Double-entry bookkeeping, bills of exchange, an extensive network of branches. All these were his superweapons, which no monarch possessed. Third, he created the world's first intelligence network based on the collection of commercial and political information. Knowledge was his main capital, allowing him to make the right decisions and stay ahead of the competition. He knew when a war would start, where a crop failure would occur, which king was on the brink of bankruptcy. Fourth, his main tool was the debt loop. He didn't just give loans. He systematically hooked the most powerful people in the world on them, turning them into his hostages. Debt became an instrument of political control. Finally, His shadow status was not a weakness, but a strength. As a commoner, he was not bound by feudal obligations, a code of honor, or territorial disputes. He was flexible, mobile, and transnational. His empire had no borders. It could not be conquered. He was invisible, and therein lay his invulnerability. Thus, Jakob Fugger was not just a banker. He was a systemic architect of a new type of power based on capital, information, and control over resources. He became the puppet master because in an age when the old strings that controlled the world, blood and land, had frayed, he managed to weave new ones made of gold. The story of Jakob Fugger is not just a biography of a rich man from the past. It is a parable that forces us to ask the eternal and most fundamental question about the nature of power. Who really rules the world? Those who stand on the stage, under the spotlights, kings, presidents, generals, or those who remain in the shadows, in the silence of their offices, controlling the invisible financial flows? The lesson of Jakob Fugger is that political power, deprived of financial independence, is an illusion. He showed that the real kings are not those who wear the crown, but those who finance it. His story is the tale of the birth of the modern world, in which the sovereignty of states, the outcome of wars, and the welfare of nations are increasingly determined not in parliaments and on battlefields, but in global financial markets, by rating agencies, and by the decisions of transnational corporations and investment funds. Fugger's shadow is longer today than ever before. His methods, control over strategic resources, the use of debt as a tool of pressure, monopolization of markets, the collection and analysis of information, have become the ABCs of modern geopolitics and big business. And looking at the world today, we see that his central paradox has not disappeared. We still see political leaders on the main stage, but we often don't know the names of those who financed their election campaigns, who own their national debt, who control the media that shapes our opinions. The story of Jakob Fugger compels us to be vigilant and always ask ourselves, when we see the puppets move, should we not try to discern, in the shadows, the hands of the puppet master pulling the golden strings? This question, posed 5 centuries ago, is more relevant today than ever.